the arena that smiled while women screamed. The empire called it celebration. The crowd called it justice. History would later call it silence. But inside the Hippodrome, it was simply power showing its teeth. The Hippodrome of Constantinople was not just an arena carved from stone. It was the beating heart of Byzantine authority. Stretching more than 400 meters long, capable of swallowing tens of thousands of bodies, it stood beside the imperial palace like a second throne. Emperors did not only rule from marble halls and gilded chambers. They ruled from here, where voices could be counted, fear could be measured, and loyalty could be tested in front of witnesses who could never deny what they had seen. The sand on its floor was imported from Egypt, pale and fine, chosen not for beauty, but for absorption. It hid blood well, at least at first. On the surface, the Hippodrome existed for chariot races, color, noise, and sport. Blues on one side, greens on the other, banners raised, throats raw from chanting. Children learned their faction before they learned their prayers. Families inherited loyalty, like a surname. But beneath the cheers, something darker was always waiting. The corridors beneath the seats were lined with iron rings set into stone, cells without windows, chambers where sound traveled upward in whispers. The architecture itself understood its purpose. This was not just entertainment. This was infrastructure for fear. Helena was born into that world of colors and allegiances. At 23, she belonged to a noble blue family whose wealth and influence depended on staying visible, loyal, and obedient. Her engagement to a blue official was not a romance. It was a political bond. Like many women of rank in Constantinople, her value was measured in alliances, silence, and compliance. She had been raised to watch the races from shaded seats, to applaud on cue, to never speak the wrong name too loudly. What she had not been raised for was to kneel in the sand where criminals and enemies were broken. When she was brought into the arena, the sun was already high, merciless against exposed skin. Iron shackles locked her wrists and ankles, forcing her onto all fours. Torn rags clung to her body, barely hiding the fresh lash marks crossing her back. The crowd did not quiet when they saw her. It grew louder. Laughter mixed with shouts. Bets changed hands. The Hippodrome did not see a woman that day. It saw a message. The Byzantines understood spectacle in a way few empires ever did. Killing was simple. Terror required choreography. Helena was placed carefully, facing away from the gates, positioned so she could hear, but not see what was coming. For hours she knelt in the burning sand, while 50,000 people watched her fear mature. Sweat mixed with blood. The smell of old death rose from beneath her palms. This was part of the ritual. Anticipation mattered more than the act itself. Behind the arena walls, guards prepared the animal. A massive bull, driven by whips and shouts, its hooves striking stone with a sound that echoed through the Hippodrome's bones. The crowd sensed the shift immediately. The noise changed, sharpening into excitement. Chanting became rhythmic, coordinated, something practiced. Helena's breathing broke into shallow gasps as she realized the sound was drawing closer. She pulled against the chains until her wrists bled, but the iron did not move. This was not an execution, at least not officially. Byzantine law rarely spoke its punishments aloud. What happened here existed in a gray space between justice and warning, between ritual and cruelty. Women like Helena were not meant to die quickly. They were meant to survive long enough for the lesson to spread, oppose the wrong faction, stand too close to rebellion, be related to the wrong man, and the Hippodrome would remember your name, even when history would not. As the bull's breath reached her back, hot and wet, Helena screamed, and the arena answered with delight. She did not yet know that others had already been broken here that week. She did not know that men trained in humiliation had planned every detail of her suffering. She only knew that the empire she had believed in was watching, and it wanted her fear more than her life. When factions became gods, they wore colors, not crowns. They spoke chants, not laws. But in Constantinople, belief mattered more than truth, and the factions demanded sacrifice. To understand why Helena was placed in the sand, chained and waiting, you have to understand the factions themselves. The blues and the greens were not sports teams in any modern sense. They were identities that swallowed everything else. By the 5th and 6th centuries, faction loyalty shaped where you lived, who you married, which churches you attended, and which officials would protect you when trouble came. Children learned to shout faction chants before they could read scripture. To belong was safety. To hesitate was danger. The origins were harmless enough, at least on the surface. Chariot racing had always been popular in the Roman world, and Constantinople inherited that obsession. But the Byzantine Empire perfected it. The Hippodrome became the one place where emperor and citizen faced each other directly, separated only by distance and ritual. When the blues cheered, emperors listened. When the greens shouted, officials took notes. The factions became voices of the street, channels through which public anger could flow. Over time, that power hardened. Each faction developed its own hierarchy, its own leaders, its own enforcers. They controlled neighborhoods, ran protection rackets, and settled disputes with fists or blades. Nighttime violence was common, and authorities often looked the other way, afraid of provoking unrest. The factions offered something the empire could not always provide: belonging. In return, they demanded absolute loyalty. Switching sides was unthinkable. Silence could be interpreted as betrayal. Religion deepened the divide. By the 6th century, theological disagreements over the nature of Christ had split society, and the factions absorbed those arguments eagerly. The blues tended to support imperial orthodoxy. The greens often sheltered dissenters. Suddenly, cheering for a chariot was no longer just entertainment. It was a public declaration of belief, politics, and faith combined. In the stands of the Hippodrome, identity was visible, counted, and judged. Emperors quickly learned how useful this system could be. By favoring one faction and threatening the other, rulers maintained balance through fear. If taxes rose, blame could be shifted. If riots erupted, rivals could be punished publicly. The Hippodrome was the stage where this manipulation played out, watched by tens of thousands. Every race, every chant, every punishment reinforced the lesson. Power flowed downward, and resistance was expensive. Women occupied a dangerous position within this world. Officially, they were excluded from faction politics. In reality, they were deeply entangled. Marriage alliances tied families together. Daughters represented future loyalty. Wives reflected their husband's status. When factions clashed, women became leverage. Harming them sent messages without directly challenging male authority. It was a strategy both effective and cruel, and it left few records because it was rarely written into law. Helena's family had risen through blue favor. Their wealth came from imperial contracts. Their protection came from visibility. But visibility cuts both ways. When unrest grew, when whispers of rebellion spread through the city, noble families were watched closely. Attendance at the Hippodrome became mandatory, not optional. Being seen mattered. Applauding at the right moment mattered. One wrong gesture could undo generations of loyalty. By the time tensions reached their breaking point, the Hippodrome had already been transformed. It was no longer just a place for races. It was an instrument of calibration, measuring how much fear the population could absorb. Public humiliations replaced executions because they lingered longer in memory. Survivors carried the lesson back into their neighborhoods. Stories spread faster than decrees. Helena's punishment was not random cruelty. It was calculated communication. By targeting a noblewoman associated with the blues, the state spoke to both factions at once. It warned the greens of the cost of opposition and reminded the blues of the price of disobedience. Her body became the medium through which power was displayed, debated, and reinforced. As the crowd watched her kneel, chanting in unison, they were not just spectators. They were participants. Each voice strengthened the ritual. Each cheer confirmed the system. And as the gates behind the arena creaked open, and the sound of hooves echoed closer, the Hippodrome prepared to prove, once again, that belief could be shaped through fear, and loyalty could be carved into flesh. The day the gates were sealed, they came to cheer, not to die. They came divided, then spoke with one voice. The emperor listened in silence, and then the exits disappeared. In January of 532 A.D., Constantinople reached the edge of something it could not pull back from. Years of heavy taxation, religious persecution, and quiet resentment had piled up like dry wood. When the chariot races were announced, the city poured into the Hippodrome, as it always did, blues filling their sections, greens filling theirs, banners raised, old rivalries humming beneath the noise. But that day, something felt wrong. The chants did not clash. They merged. A single word began to roll through the arena, first scattered, then unified, growing louder with every repetition. Nika, victory, not over rival chariots, but over the emperor himself. For the first time in memory, blues and greens were not enemies. They were a crowd. Justinian sat in the Kathisma, the imperial box overlooking the arena, listening as 50,000 voices demanded his removal. This was not a riot yet. It was worse. It was organized defiance, visible, undeniable, happening in the one place designed to magnify public will. Officials were sent to negotiate. They were shouted down. Promises were rejected. The chanting did not stop. From the stone seats, the people believed they had discovered their strength, that unity alone could bend imperial power. They did not realize the Hippodrome had been built for moments exactly like this, not to empower crowds, but to trap them. The order was given quietly. No announcement, no warning. Guards moved through the outer corridors, sealing gates one by one. Heavy wooden doors were barred. Iron locks dropped into place. At first, no one noticed. The chanting continued. Then someone tried to leave. Then another. Confusion spread like a ripple through the stands as people realized the exits were no longer openings but walls. The chanting faltered, fractured into questions, into shouts of alarm. Panic followed quickly, raw and contagious. 50,000 people understood, almost at once, that they were enclosed inside a stone vessel with an emperor who had decided not to negotiate. When Belisarius entered with his soldiers, there was no dramatic charge, no chaos at first, just disciplined movement. 3,000 heavy infantry advancing onto the arena floor, shields tight, swords drawn. The people in the lower sections tried to push backward, crushing those behind them. In the upper tiers, some attempted to climb, scraping hands raw against stone. Others jumped, choosing broken bones over blades. The soldiers advanced methodically, not rushing, not shouting, moving row by row, as they had been trained to do on battlefields against armed enemies. Here, their opponents had nothing but fear. The killing was efficient. Men fell first, then women, then children caught in the surge. There was no distinction between blue and green anymore. Loyalty had become irrelevant. Screams echoed off marble and stone, rising into the city beyond the walls. Blood soaked into the imported sand until it darkened and clumped beneath boots. Bodies piled in aisles, forcing soldiers to step over them to reach those still alive. Some begged. Some fought with bare hands. Most simply froze as death approached, minds unable to accept what their eyes were seeing. By nightfall, the Hippodrome was quiet again. The chanting was gone. The crowd was gone. What remained was silence, broken only by the sounds of cleanup, of doors opening, of bodies being dragged away. Estimates varied, but all the chroniclers agreed on one thing. Tens of thousands were dead. In a single day, inside a single building, the empire had slaughtered its own people to reassert control. The lesson was unmistakable. But the massacre was not the end of the punishment. While soldiers killed indiscriminately, imperial officials moved through the chaos with lists in hand, identifying specific faces, specific families. Certain individuals were pulled from the crowd alive, dragged away from the blood-soaked stands, and into the chambers beneath the arena. Among them were women of noble houses, wives and daughters whose only crime was connection. Helena's name was among those recorded, and while the city mourned its dead, something far more deliberate was being prepared below the Hippodrome, where survival itself would become a curse rather than a mercy. The punishments history refused to translate execution ended suffering. Survival extended it. What waited beneath the Hippodrome was not law. It was instruction. Below the arena, where cheers once rolled like thunder, the air turned cold and wet. The chambers beneath the Hippodrome were older than most of the city above, carved and expanded over generations for purposes never listed on public plans. Torchlight revealed walls scarred by chains, grooves worn into stone by bodies dragged across the floor. Sound behaved differently down here. Screams did not echo upward. They dissolved. That was the design. This was where the Empire handled problems it did not want remembered. The women taken after the riots were not treated as prisoners in any legal sense. There were no charges read, no trials promised. They were classified as warnings. 73 women, all from influential families, all associated with opposition factions, were separated, stripped of status, and held without food or water for days. The deprivation was deliberate. Hunger weakened resistance. Thirst blurred time. By the second night, many could no longer tell how long they had been there. That confusion was part of the punishment. Byzantine chroniclers rarely described what happened next in clear language. They used careful phrases, moral distance, religious metaphors. But archaeology and fragmentary accounts tell a consistent story. The punishments were public enough to be witnessed, private enough to avoid records. Women were brought up into the arena one at a time, not to be killed quickly, but to be displayed, judged, and broken according to rituals older than Christianity itself. The goal was not death. It was redefinition. Humiliation was a weapon the Byzantines understood deeply. Stripping a noblewoman of dignity did more than harm her. It destabilized her entire network. Families lost honor. Alliances fractured. Future marriages collapsed. The message spread without needing explanation. In a society built on hierarchy and appearance, shame was contagious. Survivors carried it home, and the city learned from their silence. Helena endured days in darkness before her turn came. She heard others taken before her, footsteps fading, sounds she could not place, returning women who no longer spoke. When guards finally came for her, she could barely stand. The chains were not removed. They were rearranged. Control mattered more than comfort. As she was dragged upward through the narrow passages, she could smell the arena before she saw it, that mixture of old blood, sand, and heat. The Hippodrome was open again, but the crowd was smaller, chosen carefully. Loyal citizens, faction leaders who needed reassurance, officials whose presence confirmed legitimacy. This was theater with an audience selected for obedience. When Helena emerged into the light, the noise rose immediately. Not the chaos of riots, but a disciplined excitement. The Empire was about to speak again. The animal waiting behind the gates was not chosen at random. Bulls carried symbolic weight in Roman and Near Eastern tradition, associated with strength, domination, and sacrifice. Here, it represented unstoppable force, state power made flesh. The ritual did not aim for immediate death. It aimed to demonstrate helplessness. Positioning, timing, restraint, all calculated to prolong fear without ending the spectacle too soon. What followed was carefully controlled. Guards intervened when necessary. The crowd watched every movement, every failure, every moment of endurance. Helena survived not because of mercy, but because survival was the point. The empire wanted witnesses who could walk away, women who would live with what had been done to them, carrying the lesson into their families, their neighborhoods, their future. When it was over, she was removed quickly, like equipment no longer needed. The sand was smoothed. The gates closed. The audience dispersed. Officially, nothing had happened. No laws were cited. No records were kept. The Hippodrome returned to races and cheers, and the city pretended the punishment had been an aberration, not policy. But Helena lived. And in living, she became something far more dangerous than a corpse. She became evidence. Evidence the empire could not allow to speak freely, could not allow to be remembered clearly. And as she was carried back into the darkness beneath the arena, the final phase of her punishment began, one designed not to destroy her body, but to erase her place in the world entirely. Helena and the ritual meant to leave no body. Death would have ended the story. Survival made her dangerous. The empire did not fear martyrs. It feared witnesses who kept breathing. After the arena fell silent and the crowd dispersed, Helena was not taken to a cell meant for prisoners. She was taken somewhere worse, a place reserved for people the empire wanted erased without killing. The Byzantines understood that memory could be more subversive than rebellion. A dead body created outrage. A living reminder created fear that spread quietly, efficiently, without banners or chants. Helena was no longer a person in their eyes. She was a consequence. For days after the spectacle, she drifted between fever and waking horror. Her injuries were treated just enough to prevent death. This was not mercy. It was maintenance. The women who survived these punishments were never allowed to recover fully, because recovery suggested closure. The empire needed wounds that stayed open, visible signs that obedience had limits and resistance had costs that extended far beyond the moment of defiance. Byzantine sources are deliberately vague about what followed. They speak of correction, of restoration of order, of women being removed from society. But removal did not mean exile in this simple sense. It meant systematic dismantling. Helena's name was struck from family records. Her engagement was annulled without explanation. Her dowry was confiscated by the state. Legally, she still existed. Socially, she was dead. When she was finally released from the chambers beneath the Hippodrome, she was not returned to her home. That would have risked sympathy. Instead, she was sent to a religious institution on the outskirts of the city, a place that called itself charitable and functioned as containment. Here, women like her were kept under supervision, dressed in plain garments, denied contact with their former lives. Silence was enforced through ritual, prayer, and the constant reminder of what awaited those who spoke too freely. Helena learned quickly what the empire expected from her. Now, gratitude, repentance, forgetting. She was expected to frame her survival as divine mercy, not imperial cruelty. To interpret her suffering as personal failure, not political punishment. This reframing was essential. It allowed the state to cleanse itself while transferring blame onto the victim. If she suffered, it was because she had erred. If she lived, it was because God, not the emperor, allowed it. But the body does not forget what the mind is ordered to erase. Night after night, Helena relived the sounds of the arena, the chanting crowd, the heavy breath at her back. The Hippodrome followed her into sleep, into prayer, into silence. She was not alone. Other women carried the same invisible marks, moving through the city as shadows, avoided by families who feared association. Their existence became another unspoken warning. The true cruelty of the ritual was revealed in its aftermath. The empire had not only punished Helena, it had stripped her of every role that once defined her. Daughter, bride, noblewoman, citizen, all gone. What remained was a living absence, someone people looked through rather than at. This was the final lesson of the Hippodrome. Resistance did not just risk death, it risked erasure. Years later, Chroniclers would write about the riots, the massacre, the restoration of order. They would praise Justinian's resolve, his defense of stability. Helena's name would not appear, nor would the names of most women who survived those days. History would move forward, polished and selective, while the survivors aged quietly, carrying memories no one wanted recorded. And yet fragments remained, in letters never sent, in marginal notes, in archaeological traces beneath the arena where chains once scraped stone. Helena lived long enough to understand that what had been done to her was not excess. It was design. And as long as empires required fear to govern, the Hippodrome's ritual would never truly end. Why empires bury their women first stone remembers what ink refuses to write. Empires survive by choosing what must be forgotten. Civilization is polished on the surface. Its foundations are built in silence. Long after the blood was washed from the Hippodrome's sand, and the city returned to its rituals of prayer and commerce, Constantinople told itself a story. It spoke of order restored, of divine favor, of an emperor who saved the empire from chaos. Churches rose higher. Mosaics gleamed brighter. Laws were copied, preserved, admired by later generations as proof of Byzantine sophistication. What the city did not speak of were the people who survived the punishment, because survivors complicate myths. Helena did not die young, as many expected. She lived long enough to watch the empire harden around its own version of memory. Her body healed, but her position in the world never returned. She moved through streets where people avoided her eyes, not out of cruelty, but fear. To acknowledge her was to acknowledge what the state preferred to keep buried. Silence became a shared survival strategy, adopted by victim and witness alike. This was not unique to Byzantium. What made the empire remarkable was how carefully it combined faith, law, and spectacle into a single system of control. Public violence alone creates rebellion. Private cruelty alone creates rumors. But ritualized punishment, witnessed by crowds and then erased from records, creates obedience that feels natural. The Hippodrome was the perfect machine for this process. It transformed political resistance into moral failure and state terror into divine necessity. Later historians struggled with this contradiction. How could a Christian empire that built Hagia Sophia also engineer suffering so precisely? The answer lies not in hypocrisy, but in function. Empires do not abandon brutality when they adopt religion or law. They refine it. They wrap it in language that shifts responsibility away from power and onto victims. Women like Helena were ideal targets because their suffering could be framed as correction rather than oppression, morality rather than politics. Archaeology has begun to expose what chronicles softened. The underground chambers beneath the Hippodrome, the iron fixtures embedded in stone, the logistical complexity of crowd control and containment. These were not improvisations. They were permanent features, designed, maintained, used. Each generation inherited the structure and the knowledge of how to employ it, even when it pretended otherwise. What history ultimately hid was not the violence itself, but its intent. The purpose was never spectacle alone. It was education. Every scream taught the crowd where the limits were. Every survivor taught families how to behave. Every erased name reminded future chroniclers what subjects were safer to avoid. The empire did not need to repeat the lesson often. Once was enough, if done correctly. Helena's existence lingered like an unresolved question. She knew what had been done to her was not an exception, but a template. Others would suffer in different forms, under different rulers, using different justifications. The tools would change. The logic would not. Power would always prefer fear that feels deserved over violence that looks naked. When modern audiences admire Byzantine achievements, they are not wrong to do so. The empire preserved knowledge, shaped law, influenced religion for centuries. But admiration without confrontation creates another layer of forgetting. Civilization is not invalidated by its cruelty, but it is incomplete without acknowledging it. The Hippodrome was as central to Byzantine identity as its churches, and the silence around it was just as carefully constructed. Helena died quietly, without monuments, without inscriptions. The empire moved on, but the stones beneath the old arena remained, holding impressions of chains and footsteps long after voices faded. They remind us that history is not only what survives in books, it is also what power worked hardest to erase. And that is the final truth the Hippodrome offers. Empires do not fall because they are cruel. They fall because they believe cruelty can be hidden forever.